Picture this. Out in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, a single, rusty oil tanker suddenly becomes the flashpoint in a standoff between the world's biggest military powers. Now, this isn't just about one ship. It's really about sanctions, about international law, and maybe the new rules of a global shadow war. So let's get into it. The day is January 7th, 2026. U.S. forces are boarding an oil tanker that's being escorted by a Russian nuclear submarine. Yeah, that one move sent ripples through global markets and foreign ministries around the world. So the question is, how on earth did we get to this point? To really get the gravity of that moment, we have to rewind a bit. We need to look at the chain of events that led to this seizure, because this was a chase that went on for weeks and stretched clear across an ocean. So this whole thing was basically a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game on the open sea. It all kicked off in the Caribbean in late December 2025. The U.S. starts tracking this tanker, the Bella 1. Then, on Christmas Eve of all days, things get complicated. The vessel gets temporary authorization to fly the Russian flag. As the chase moves out into the Atlantic, the crew quickly renames the ship Marinera and slaps a crudely painted Russian flag on its hull. But the stakes get a whole lot higher on January 6th, when Russia sends in the Kazan, a nuclear-powered submarine, to act as an armed escort. And yet, the very next day, 300 miles south of Iceland, U.S. forces boarded and seized the ship anyway.
So, you have to ask, why would the United States risk a direct face-off with a Russian nuclear submarine? Well, the answer seems to lie in a brand new, hardline policy of enforcing economic sanctions. Let's take a look at their official reasoning.
The U.S., along with its ally, the U.K., argued that this tanker was part of what they call a shadow fleet. You know, this network of older ships with murky ownership used to secretly move sanctioned oil from countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, trying to stay off the grid. They claim that the ship trying to switch to a Russian flag in the middle of a voyage was totally illegitimate. And in their eyes, that made the ship stateless, meaning it was fair game for seizure on the high seas. The whole thing was billed as a new zero-tolerance policy on anyone trying to dodge sanctions. Well, as you can probably guess, Russia had a completely different take on what happened. For Moscow, this wasn't about enforcing sanctions. To them, it was a direct attack on international maritime law and on their own national sovereignty. And the response didn't come from just anywhere. It came directly from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which lodged a very sharp, very formal protest. Their statement didn't pull any punches. They called the U.S. action, and I'm quoting here, a gross violation of fundamental principles and norms of international maritime law and the freedom of navigation. That line really cuts to the core of their entire legal argument. Okay, so what's really interesting are the specific legal points they made. Russia's argument was, look, this vessel was lawfully flying our flag. Under international law, that means we have exclusive jurisdiction. Simple as that. They also made a point to say they repeatedly told the U.S. the ship was a civilian vessel with legal status. And they went even further, accusing Washington of having neo-colonialist ambitions. And they weren't alone in this. China publicly sided with Russia, saying the U.S. had seriously violated international law. So here's the thing. Both sides are claiming that international law is on their side. And to understand how that's even possible, we need to quickly look at the law itself, specifically a core principle called the freedom of the high seas. At the heart of this whole fight is the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, or UN Clause. It establishes this idea of the freedom of the high seas. Basically, it means a ship is like a little piece of floating territory of the nation whose flag it flies. And normally, only that flag state gets to say what happens to it. This right here is the bedrock of Russia's entire case. But is it really that simple? Can that freedom be challenged? Well, that is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a huge point of debate in international law. And this slide right here gets us to the absolute core of the legal fight. On one side, you have the U.S. saying they were in hot pursuit of a ship that was already stateless before it tried to quickly raise a Russian flag. But on the other side, you have the counter-argument, which is that one country simply can't decide that another country's flag is invalid. The argument goes that if you allow that, it would just create total chaos on the oceans. Now, this wasn't just some abstract legal debate happening in diplomatic memos. The confrontation out there on the water sent immediate and very real shockwaves through global energy markets and military command centers. So the market reaction was probably not what you'd expect. You'd think a military standoff involving an oil tanker would cause prices to spike, right? But they actually fell. Why? Well, the world was already swimming in oil. There was a supply glut, and the U.S. said it was going to sell all the confiscated crude, pushing even more supply onto the market. But for the legitimate shipping industry, it was a totally different story. All of a sudden, the risk of your ship getting seized was very real. So buyers scrambled to book tankers that were fully transparent, Western insured, the whole deal. The result? Daily rental rates for these giant carriers shot up to 5-year highs. This one incident created a very clear set of economic winners and losers. And this really shows you how military alliances and economic vulnerability are all tangled up together. For a country like Russia, whose government budget depends so heavily on oil and gas money, anything that disrupts their ability to export that energy is a huge threat to their economic stability. And Russia's response wasn't just diplomatic. Shortly after the tanker was seized, they test-fired a brand-new nuclear-capable Orozhnik ballistic missile, and the target was pointedly close to NATO's borders. It was a very clear, very forceful signal that Moscow was willing to escalate. So after all that, what does this actually mean for the future? Well, this one incident might have just set a very dangerous and unpredictable new precedent in how nations deal with each other. Let's just sum up the big takeaways here, because this really does feel like a major shift. First, we're seeing sanctions evolve from just being economic tools to becoming actual reasons for direct military action. Second, that shadow fleet that has been operating in this legal gray zone for years, its cloak of immunity has just been ripped away. And third, these long-standing ideas about maritime law and sovereign protection on the high seas, they're now officially up for grabs. And all of this leaves us with one final and pretty unsettling question. We seem to be entering an era where economic policy can be enforced by warships. That challenges a century of international norms. So in this new reality, you have to wonder, where exactly is the new line between enforcement